Hello, good evening. It's really nice to be here with all of you. My name is Lizzi Heydemann. I'm the rabbi at Mishkan in Chicago. It's really an honor to be here with all of you and with teachers and colleagues of mine for this night of learning and conversation, and maybe a little bit of squirming and growing and questions. About 2 weeks ago-ish on Sunday, in the midst of bombs dropping and rockets flying and anxiety just, pulsating through all of our collective veins all over the country and world, we, the rabbis of the Jewish Emergent Network, got on a little thread and said, like, oh my God, what do we do? There was this like sort of collective sense of like, how do we speak with and among our communities? Something is different. Something feels very different this time, but like not even exactly being able to put words to it. And so there have been many words spoken and written, and there will continue to be many words spoken and written in and beyond all of our communities. But we very quickly realized that it would be great to start the conversation together among communities that are wrestling with many of the same kinds of questions. And we have no better leadership in this tonight than with Daniel Sokatch. And want to say thank you to Rabbi Brous at ICAR for so quickly mobilizing and putting this all together for us tonight. And before turning it over to Rabbi Noa Kushner to introduce Daniel, I will just say to everybody, Zoom hygiene tonight. We will be disabling the chat so that we can all really focus. If you want the transcript along the bottom of the screen, go to the lower right-hand corner where it says live transcript. You can have that. And if you have a question, and we're really going to be encouraging questions, and I know Daniel has already said, like, bring them, bring the questions you're afraid to ask, or that you don't know if you're allowed to say, like, bring them. Tonight is really designed to be a safe and brave space for conversation in community. So use the Q&A function to type your questions. I hope I'm not missing anything. If I am, Rabbi Noa Kushner, you'll fill it in. Anyway, thank you all so much for being here tonight. Over to you.
Thank you, Rabbi Lizzi, and thank you to Rabbi Sharon and Ikar for bringing this all together. It's so good to be together. I have the honor of introducing our speaker, Daniel Sokatch, CEO of the New Israel Fund. And he's really the person that we all call during weeks like the ones we just had. He's the guy you want in the room. This is because he will patiently explain, as I'm sure he will tonight, without judgment and with compassion, what's really worth our attention, what we most need to pursue, and why. And the fact that he took the time to put this all in a forthcoming book, Can We Talk About Israel, is the title. It's nothing less than a gift. And although he has a lot of articles and awards, what you really need to know, what I admire most, is that while Israel is on everyone's minds at this moment, for years, decades, Daniel has gotten on planes, made the calls, showed up in the places, taken the bullets, left the comforts of a beautiful home, an incredible wife, and thoughtful daughters, just to make sure the dream of democracy in Israel lives to see another day. We're really grateful to you, Daniel, for your service and for your perspective. We need you more than ever.
Thanks, Rabbi Noah. Thank you all for inviting me to be with you. As I said in the virtual green room a moment ago, it's really an honor for me to be here with all of you and with this community because two of my rabbis are on this call. I have the great honor of being one of the founding board members of ICAR, and I think it's fair to say the founding board member of the Kitchen and the first board chair of the Kitchen. And these are extracurricular tasks that I really enjoyed and were wonderful honors for me. So it's nice to be back with the even larger and still growing emergent community. So I think what I'll try to do briefly, but not too briefly, is to get us on the same page about how we got to where we are today in Israel. And today is actually quite an auspicious day for us to be having this conversation because, you know, as Rabbi Lizzi said a couple of weeks ago, your rabbis were on an email chain saying, what are we going to do? How do we respond? How do we understand this? And just 2 weeks later, in further proof, if it was needed, which I'm sure it isn't for most of us, that the one thing that is constant when it comes to Israel is change, right? Constant change. One of my board members, Talia Sasson, former chief prosecutor of the state of Israel, said to me a couple of years ago, Daniel, 2 months in Israel is like 2 years in the United States. And that crazy time warp frame has only accelerated because today, 2 weeks later, there's huge news out of Israel, which everyone on this call is probably familiar with, and I'm sure we'll get to it later, which is that it seems against all imaginable odds, opposition leader Yair Lapid of the Yesh Atid, There Is a Future Party, has managed to cobble together a Frankenstein's monster of an opposition coalition, of a change coalition, he calls it, consisting of parties of the right, center, left, and Arab sectors of the Israeli political scene. And as of midnight Israel time tonight, he had gone to President Reuven Rivlin in the president's residence and said, I have a government. And the president gave him his blessing. He presented the president with his signed document, including all of these parties. And one of my Israeli colleagues this morning said to me, 5 hours before midnight, the deadline in Israel, she said, well, the next 5 hours are going to be very, very shaky. And then the next week is going to be very, very shaky because the next thing that has to happen is that sometime next week, the Knesset, the parliament, needs to have a vote of confidence in this new government. And in that period of a week, anything can happen. The Netanyahu forces will undoubtedly be trying to get defectors. Events may intervene. So she said that next week will be shaky. And then she says, if they get to the finish line and a new government is seated, then the next 4 years will be shaky. So everything is shaky. But again, for those of us who believe that nothing was really going to change, looks like things might change. And below that headline was another headline, which, although less dramatic and probably ultimately less important, is equally significant for our purposes, because part of our purpose, in my opinion, is to remember that when things seem hopeless and when hope seems lost, the obligation of us as Jews in the world is to roll up our sleeves and keep pushing, right? One of these rabbis once told me that Heschel said that despair is the worst sin, the greatest sin for Jews. It's a luxury that we don't have time for. And if you can't cite Heschel with that quote, blame the rabbis, not me. But in that sense, I'm truly a Heschelian Jew. And that second, smaller but still enormously significant headline is that there was another election in Israel today, not just the conclusion of the one that took place in March with the coalition. And that was the election in the Knesset, in the parliament, for the next president of the state of Israel, which is the head of state. It's a largely symbolic but very important bully pulpit in Israel, like the Queen of England in Israel, with similar responsibilities, but especially in the hands of its current resident, Ruby Rivlin, a man of the political right, but an extraordinary defender of democracy, including, I should say, the New Israel Fund and our sector in Israel. It has become a very important, I don't want to call it a check or balance or bulwark, but kind of a check or balance or bulwark against the most extreme impulses of right-wing legislatures. And I'll give you an example. A few years ago, the Israeli parliament passed something called the nation-state law, which said, among other things, that only Jews could determine the fate and future of the state of Israel, and degraded Arabic from an official state language to a special status language. Now, we can debate the merits of the law, its flaws. I think it was a terrible, almost disastrous development for Israel, upending for now the balance that had been so carefully achieved between Judaism and democracy. Others feel differently. But one person who agreed with me was President Rivlin, who said when the law was still a bill, if it's passed and it comes to my desk, I will sign it, as I'm obligated to do as the president of Israel, but I'll sign it in Arabic to register my protest at making any Israeli citizens feel lesser. And that's exactly what he did. And there's no doubt that Bougie Herzog, Isaac Herzog, a scion of one of the great aristocratic Israeli families, his great-grandfather, or his grandfather was Israel's first Ashkenazi chief rabbi. His father was an early president of the state of Israel. Bougie Herzog, a man of integrity, a moderate guy, a former leader of the Labor Party, I believe is going to carry on Rivlin's tradition of seeing the presidency as an important calming and cooling position in a state of Israel that really needs it. So with that update on what happened today, let's go back a month, right? Because if you woke up on May 10th and you just saw Hamas at 6 p.m. Israel time lob barrage after barrage of rockets and missiles at the towns and communities just west of Jerusalem, then of course the Israeli military responded as it was certain to do, and then the 10-day war that ensued, you would think to yourself, well, this is a pretty cut and dry, open shut case, and we may have a debate over proportionality. Did Israel respond proportionately or not? But, and this is very much the official line out of the Israeli government right now, and many of its defenders in the world, it's pretty obvious. Hamas just fired rockets and Israel had to respond as any country would. And that, for what it's worth, is true, right? Everything I just said is what happened. And it is true that Hamas decided to escalate this conflict the way they did. But if we pull the camera back and we put things in context, the story takes a bit of a different shape. Hamas's decision to do what it did, while murderous and cynical, seems a lot more rational than it otherwise might. And we begin to understand how there is no such thing about looking at any of these events in isolation. If we want to do justice to what's really happening, we have to see them in context relative to each other and relative to the history of the last 100 years or so. So the spark that lights the fuse that leads to the shooting war, right, and the other things that have happened in the last month, is really a dispute over protests in an East Jerusalem neighborhood called Sheikh Jarrah. Now, for those of you who are on the call who know everything I'm talking about, I think it's probably my duty now to not assume everyone does. So I'll try to give a quick briefing, and bear with me if you know what I'm saying. I'll try to make it painless. Sheikh Jarrah is a neighborhood in which 6 Arab, Palestinian, East Jerusalemite families are currently facing an eviction that has been in the court system, winding its way up through the courts for over 12 years now, and was on May 10th, the very Monday that the shooting war started, the aerial war started, was to be heard by the Supreme Court, the High Court of Justice in Israel, as the denouement of this case. It was meant to be the big High Court hearing about this case to evict these 6 families. And in order to understand that, we have to take a step back to 1947-48. Right? And as many of us know, in 1947-48, Israel fought its war of independence, which Palestinians refer to as their Nakba, their catastrophe, their dispossession and displacement from their home. And I'm going to argue, in my opinion, very much in the emergent community tradition, both of these things are true, right? What was the salvation for the Jewish people and the country that would become the Israelis was simultaneously the dispossession for the Palestinian people. And the history that's unspooled since then, I think, is a reflection of those two truths, those two narratives, which are sometimes in conflict and clashing, sometimes competing, but both also coexisting and true. So in the war of 47-48, after the British mandate ends, the United Nations declares in one of its earliest acts that it will partition what was formerly the British mandatory territory of Palestine into 2 states, one Jewish, one Palestinian Arab. That's accepted by the Zionist leadership. It's rejected by the Arab leadership. Most of us know the story. Thus commences a sort of civil war as the British are leaving between Jewish and Arab Palestinians. It's confusing because before the state of Israel is established, they're all Palestinians. And then after that establishment, after May, it moves to a second phase, this war, when surrounding Arab countries invade Israel. Israel defeats them. It actually gains territory larger than what it was allotted by the United Nations in the proposed partition plan. And the armistice line, when the UN finally is able to achieve a ceasefire, the armistice line is drawn with a green pencil, thus the name the Green Line. And on one side of the armistice line is what the international community then recognized as Israel. And so that when you hear about the 67 borders or the Green Line, that's what people are talking about. On the other side of the Green Line was the territory that we now think of as the West Bank and East Jerusalem. During this war, and here's where I'm going to say something that may be upsetting for people to hear, maybe not, but right now we're just talking about the facts. During this war, there was almost like a terrible choreography of mass displacement and population transfer. 700,000 Arabs either fled or were forcibly kicked out of what is now Israel. The vast majority of them were forced over the Green Line into Jordanian-held West Bank or East Jerusalem territory. Others went to Gaza, which was held by Egypt, and other places as well. But for our purposes, and for the purpose of this story, the majority of them are pushed over the Green Line into Jordanian-controlled territory. About 10,000 Jews living in the Jewish quarter of the Old City and in some of the newer communities that were built in what's now the West Bank before 1948, during the Zionist movement in the late 19th, early 20th century, are also kicked out by the Jordanian Legion over the Green Line to the west in what is today Israel. In the years that follow the war, about 700,000 Jews from North Africa and the Arab world are kicked out or flee their countries, who are now hostile with Israel, many of them making their way to the new state of Israel. So like I said, a dance of what we would today call ethnic cleansing. I know that's a very, very difficult word. I don't really think it behooves us to have a debate about it now. I'm just saying that what happened then, this massive population transfer, resulted in the demographic arrangement that we had on the map when we get to 1967. And the reason that's important is because one of the things that the Jordanians do in East Jerusalem is a thing that the Israelis are doing in West Jerusalem. In West Jerusalem, many of the Jews who were kicked out or fled, the 10,000 Jews from the eastern side of the Green Line, are settled in homes in West Jerusalem that were lived in by Arabs. And by the way, many, many more of the 700,000 or so new immigrants to Israel from the Middle East and North African countries are also settled in these houses. I lived in one of these houses for a while in a neighborhood called Musrara before I dropped out of rabbinical school in 1993. So in East Jerusalem, a number of families were settled in the neighborhood Sheikh Jarrah. The Jordanians built houses for them. There they lived for about 70 some odd years. These families who had been kicked out or fled West Jerusalem and Israel proper were housed in these homes built for them by the Jordanians in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. After 1967, Israel captures the West Bank and it captures East Jerusalem. It will later in 1980 annex East Jerusalem, an annexation not recognized by any country in the world, including, by the way, the Trump administration even didn't recognize it, even as they moved the embassy. But Israel now governs and has governed all of Jerusalem as if it is one city, despite the fact that the vast majority of Arab East Jerusalemites do not have Israeli citizenship. A couple of years later, in 1970, Israel passed a law that enabled people to make claims on territory that they could prove Jews owned in what was now unified, the eastern side of Jerusalem, what had been Jordanian Jerusalem. And that is the essence of the case that wound its way up to the Supreme Court and that was going to be heard on Monday the 10th, right? Now, the problem is that law that I just described is not, it's not applied in reverse. That is to say, Arab Jerusalemites who lost property in West Jerusalem, where there are now Jewish families or 20-something-year-olds like I was in 1993 living in them, cannot sue to regain those properties. But people representing Jewish owners can. And at some point after 1967, the alleged deed, I'm only saying alleged because the case has not yet been resolved at the Supreme Court, the deed that was apparently held by two Jewish trusts who purchased Sheikh Jarrah, the neighborhood, the property in the 1870s, was transferred to a group of settlers. That is to say, Jewish Israelis who wish to increase the Jewish presence in East Jerusalem and in the West Bank. There are now almost 700,000 Jewish Israelis living in settlements, communities, towns, cities, neighborhoods in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. This is considered by the rest of the world, most of the rest of the world, once again, including the United States, after a brief Trump intermission. This is considered illegal to do. It is under the Fourth Geneva Convention, a violation of international law to move your population into a territory that you're occupying. Again, we can discuss or debate that later. Those are the contours of the case. The case is for Palestinians a microcosm of everything that they have experienced since 1948. Again, the dispossession and loss of their homeland. But it's also something that's very much in accordance with an official Israeli policy, a master plan that was published in 2004, that stipulates that Israeli policy in Jerusalem is to keep the Arab population in the city to about 30%. The Arab population in the city today is around 40% in Jerusalem. So you can see why Palestinian Jerusalemites, Arab Jerusalemites, and many others, including a lot of liberal Israeli Jews and a lot of Arab Israeli citizens, see this as both an unequal application of the law, but also a continuation of a policy of dispossession and frankly, demographic engineering in the city of Jerusalem, and something that represents a great injustice to them. It's that Sheikh Jarrah issue that was coming to its head on May 10th. There have been protests there for years and years and years. I've been to them. Many of you have been to them. It was coming to its head on May 10th, and it bumped into the month of Ramadan, the holiest month of the Muslim year, a time of high tensions in Jerusalem as Muslims seek access to the third holiest site in Islam, the Al-Aqsa Dome of the Rock complex, which is where the temple once stood and is right above the Western Wall Plaza. And those of you who have been there know it's all very much cheek to jowl, the same place. We're talking meters or yards of difference, not kilometers or miles of difference. And Ramadan this year was made even more tense, not only because of the Sheikh Jarrah protests, which were happening, by the way, a few hundred meters from the Damascus Gate, but because the police inexplicably decided to close off access to the plaza in front of Damascus Gate, which is sort of East Jerusalem Town Square, Palestine, right? To people breaking their iftar Ramadan fasts, to the cultural events and musical events and market that usually happens there. So this enraged people even more. And then two 17-year-old Palestinian kids got on the Jerusalem light rail, walked up to an ultra-Orthodox Jew who was minding his own business, sitting there on the train, slapped him in the face and filmed it, uploaded it onto TikTok, which inspired several copycat attacks. In response to this, a Jewish organization called Lahava, which began as an anti-miscegenation organization, right? You can't make it up. An organization that was trying to terrify and intimidate couples, Arab-Jewish mixed couples, into splitting up, protesting any Arab-Jewish relationship, but has become more of an all-purpose thug outfit, descended upon Jerusalem, getting into fights with Arab people, threatening to march on the old city. And meanwhile, what's also happening is that these tensions and Ramadan is coinciding with three new holidays on the Jewish calendar: Independence Day, Memorial Day, Independence Day, and the most controversial of all, Jerusalem Day, which is celebrated by not all, but some Israelis to commemorate the conquest and reunification of the city of Jerusalem under Israeli rule, and is always celebrated with, among other things, something called a flag march, where hundreds or thousands of mostly young, mostly ultra-nationalist and religious youth parade through the Damascus Gate to the Muslim Quarter, and from the Muslim Quarter into the Western Wall Plaza. This is an act of deliberate provocation. I'm very proud that one of NIF's grantees, Tag Ma'ir, that some of you may know, stand physically each year between the mobs and the shopkeepers and residents of the old city. These are Jews and Arabs alike, handing out flowers, which, used to strike me as very sweet and a little hokey, but after this last month strikes me as unbelievably courageous and very, very beautiful. So Jerusalem Day is coming. Tensions are rising. People realize things are not good. And on May 10th, three things happen. First, the Attorney General asks the Supreme Court to delay the hearing about Sheikh Jarrah for a month, which the court agrees to do. Second, the police finally finish taking down the barriers around the Damascus Gate Plaza, realizing that might have been a mistake and inflamed tensions more. And third, Netanyahu himself, the Prime Minister of Israel himself, intervenes in the Jerusalem March and orders that it be rerouted so it doesn't go through Damascus Gate and through the Muslim Quarter, but rather through the Jaffa Gate and the Christian and Armenian quarters to the Jewish Quarter, a much less provocative route. But it's too little, too late. And that afternoon, again, for reasons that I still don't fully understand, the Israeli police raid the Al-Aqsa Dome of the Rock complex, get into a confrontation with hundreds and hundreds of Palestinian youth. Many of them are injured. The youth have been stockpiling stones in the complex with which to confront the marauding militant settler youth who they're expecting on the Flag Day, the Flag March. In a way, this is like a Sharks and a Jets moment. It's almost like a war of teenagers, a war that teenagers provoked. The police raid the Al-Aqsa complex. Keep in mind that in 1967, when Israel conquered and reunified the city, Moshe Dayan, the guy with the eye patch, who was then the defense minister, was watching from the Mount of Olives the progress of Israeli troops in the old city. And when he saw through his binoculars Israeli troops raise an Israeli flag over the Dome of the Rock, he phoned his commander on the Temple Mount and said, "What are you doing? Are you trying to start World War III?" So that's the place where the Israeli police raid. Sitting in Gaza, Hamas is watching and waiting and making a plan. Now, Hamas, the autocratic Islamic ultra-fundamentalist party that rules Gaza after a short, sharp civil war between Fatah, which is the party of the PLO, which runs the West Bank, and the Palestinian Authority for control in Gaza in 2007, Hamas won, kicked out Fatah. And so really, we talk about the Palestinians and the Israelis, but really, there are the Israelis, there's the West Bank Palestinians and the PA, run by Fatah out of Ramallah, and there's Hamas running Gaza. Hamas is increasingly unpopular in Gaza. It's autocratic. It's all the things that you think it is. And as I said, it's murderous. It's cynical, but it is not an irrational actor. So when you hear people like former Ambassador Ron Dermer say, those rockets that Hamas fired were fired because they want to genocide all the Jews. Now, they may want to genocide all the Jews. I can't speak to that, right? They certainly have in their rhetoric a lot of horrible anti-Semitic imagery and language, and they've also negotiated with Israel. So I can't speak to that. What I can tell you is this. They were not through the launching of over 4,000 rockets and missiles trying to kill every Jew, right? They killed 12 people in Israel, 3 of whom were not Israelis, several of whom were Palestinian citizens of Israel, and they knew that they weren't going to kill a lot of Jews. They didn't do that to kill Jews. They did it because after they gave the ultimatum at 6 p.m., if Israel doesn't remove its police from the Dome of the Rock, Al-Aqsa complex, and doesn't stop the eviction proceeding against Sheikh Jarrah, there will be a terrible answer. The Israeli IDF and military intelligence said, we don't really think there's any serious thing here. They're bluffing. 6 p.m., they launched the rockets. They did it because they were making a bid for primacy in Palestinian internal politics. A month after Mahmoud Abbas, leader of Fatah, leader of the Palestinian Authority, canceled the first election scheduled in 15 years, in which Hamas hoped to make up some territory in the West Bank for its sad state of affairs in Gaza, and which Abbas feared was going to leave him in exactly that position, thus canceling the election. So Hamas did what it did because of those considerations, and it knew it could now make a bid for the mantle of being the champion of Al-Quds, Jerusalem, the defender of the Dome of the Rock, the champions of Sheikh Jarrah, and try to make a bid for Palestinian hearts and minds in the West Bank and in Gaza. We all know what happened after that. I won't go into it, the war that is, except to say a couple of things. One, for the first time in over 70 years, the violence that began in Jerusalem and spread to the shooting war between IDF and Hamas spilled over into the streets of Israel's mixed cities. And I can't emphasize enough how terrifying that is for me, for New Israel Fund, and for any of us who care about Israel, because that showed the way to Bosnia, to Belfast, to India, a situation where Israel's fragile balance, right, can't hold. 22% of the citizenry of Israel are Arab citizens of Israel, right? Now, they had been told for 12 years of the Netanyahu administration in many different ways, legislatively through the nation state law I mentioned and other laws, and rhetorically from the prime minister, the Arabs are being bussed to the polls in droves to get out his vote in 2015. Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman, who's now part of the Change Coalition, any non-loyal Arab citizen should be beheaded, and you can't make it up. You just go ahead and Google it and check me. They had been told by MK Smotrich, one of the new ultra-right wingers ushered into the parliament by the prime minister in the last couple of years, who said just the other day, Arab citizens are citizens for now, right? They had heard this again and again. They had seen Sheikh Jarrah, and things just exploded on the streets of Israel, where mobs of Jewish and Arab, mostly young people, attacked each other. that's a small minority of Arabs and Israelis in the citizens of Israel. The vast majority abhor this, and I'm very proud that NIF grantees like Standing Together, Omdim B'Yachad in Hebrew, and Tag Ma'ir have held rallies and protests around the country in which tens of thousands of Jews and Arabs have stood together saying we refuse to be enemies. The penultimate thing I'll say is that this was different in the media too. The New York Times covered this in the American media, covered these events in a very different way than they've ever covered anything before. And it was different in the Democratic Party, where not just the Squad and Bernie and Elizabeth Warren, but also stalwart defenders of Israel like Bob Menendez of New Jersey and Jerry Nadler of New York, people with huge Jewish constituencies who are really pro-Israel, also essentially fired warning shots across Israel's bow when it comes to policy, and at President Biden's bow when it comes to unconditioned American support for all Israeli policies. This is a big change. It's also reflected, I think, in what's changing in the Jewish community. And then the final awful thing is, of course, the outbreak of anti-Semitism in America and in the UK, a new kind of anti-Semitism, different from the murderous ultra-right-wing anti-Semitism that we got so unfortunately used to during the Trump administration, and different from what I would argue is not actually necessarily anti-Semitism at all, certain kinds of criticism of Israel that may make us uncomfortable. These were people, mostly it seems radicalized Muslim, Arab immigrants or others, who are using the excuse of Israeli actions to target Jews. So obviously this is an extraordinarily worrying development, and had we done this talk before today, it would have ended on this extremely down note. But of course, rewind to what we started with, there is change despite all of this afoot in Israel today.
All right. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you so much. That was an incredible introduction for us. And I'm sure that there are many, many questions here. So I'm going to give you a chance to catch your breath, and then we're going to dive in. I really deeply appreciate that history. Okay, so where do we start? I think one of the great challenges of this conversation is how deeply emotional this is for all of us. We feel that there's so much at stake, that the risk is simply so great, that in some ways creating the space for a narrative that's different from our own narrative, whoever our own will endanger people's lives in some way. And I think that in many ways, our Jewish community has perpetuated that sense. When people speak outside of the script that we're given, the kind of classic established American Jewish communal script, we're often told that we're traitorous, and I think it's not just out of cruelty that people are lobbing those labels, but really out of fear. I mean, there's a sense that what American Jews say over here could actually endanger the lives of literally my brother and my family and many of our families over there. And yet, in your book and here, I mean, you really do. By the way, the book is called "Can We Talk About Israel?" as Noah said earlier, and I mean. You speak very powerfully to a dual narrative approach to this conflict, and you seem not to be afraid. Can you talk a little bit about what exactly might be at stake in this moment in opening ourselves up to talking about the Nakba, to talking about a Palestinian narrative, even one that might really challenge what we've been raised to believe about the establishment of the state? What might be the risks of doing that? And what are the risks of not doing that in this time?
Well, first of all, I remember something that you teach, and I'm sure still teach, and I wish I could cite where it comes from in the text, but the idea is basically that you can't build a house on a rotten foundation. And I think most of us sort of understand intuitively that that's the case in our relationship with our own country, right? Like we grew up as Americans, and I don't want to generalize, but these are emergent communities. So many of us are fairly open-minded, liberal-minded people, right? We grew up as Americans who understood that there were a number of narratives for this country. There are the narratives that white Americans have, and those are different. Those aren't all the same. There is the narrative that that Native Americans have. There is the narrative that those who were brought to this country against their will and enslaved for centuries have. And all of those together are valid narratives, even if, again, at times they clash and threaten each other. And I think we pretty much, well, I shouldn't say pretty much, a majority of our country, however small, has come to terms with that and understands that the only way to build a future where we're all sort of Americans and devoted to the American project is one in which we recognize those narratives and that we don't have to be afraid of them, right? Like being honest about what happened with enslaved peoples in this country or to Native Americans doesn't mean that you can't be a patriotic American who believes in a different kind of vision for your country. And I think the same thing is true when it comes to Israel. And there, you know, specifically to your question, there's a heartbreak for me about it because I lived in Israel between 1993 and 1995. And the education minister for during that period was a woman called Shulamit Aloni, who was the head of the party the Meretz party. In those days, Meretz had 12 seats, right? Which is like just about as many as Meretz and Labor have combined at this point in time. And they were the junior partner in Yitzhak Rabin's administration. And she was the the minister of education. And so Israeli kids grew up with that dual narrative in their textbooks. And frankly, it wasn't until the ministry of Naftali Bennett, who will very likely be the next prime minister of the state of Israel, that was changed in the civics textbooks that Israeli kids had in high school, right? This idea that Jewish Israelis have this way that we understand where we are, Arab citizens of Israel have this way of understanding where we are, and now we have to build a future together. That's something that has been excised from much of the official, truly excised from much of the official discourse in Israel, but it's still very much there. And I was fortunate enough to live in Israel at a time when that was rising to the surface. And it's the great honor I have now to work with, you know, tens of thousands of Israelis for whom that's the agenda, to really show that there's no future for Israel that isn't a shared Jewish-Arab future. There's no future for Israeli democracy that doesn't depend on a partnership between Jews and Arabs. And I'll just say parenthetically, one of the great ironies of today is that Bibi Netanyahu, who more than almost any other person, and certainly more than any other Israeli prime minister, is responsible for the rhetorical climate in which so many Israeli Arabs felt that they had been reduced to a kind of second-class citizenship, a de jure second-class citizenship after always feeling that they were de facto second-class citizens. It's Bibi Netanyahu who crosses the Rubicon in Israeli politics by saying, Mansour Abbas, you and your Islamic fundamentalist Ram party can join our coalition. He did that not out of any largesse, but because he had no other choice. If he hoped to pull a coalition together 4 weeks ago, and was hoisted on his own petard when Mr. Smotrich, who I mentioned before, and his partner, MK Ben Gvir, an out Kahanist, a follower of Meir Kahane, said, there's no way we will ever serve in a coalition government with those terrorists, right? And those terrorist supporters. So Netanyahu actually crosses the Rubicon and says, by the way, here's the parlor game. Can anyone tell me the last time an Arab party was part of the ruling coalition? The answer is there is no last time. During the Rabin era, the Arab parties worked as a blocking majority outside of the coalition for reasons that they had and reasons why Labor had and Rabin had. They decided not to actually officially enter the coalition, but rather work as partners from the outside, meaning after Shas left the government, they had 5 seats. They left the government in 93 because of Oslo, and the government was propped up from the outside by the 5 Arab seats. So it was Meretz and Labor, imagine that, were the government with an assist from 5 Arab seats. So Bibi was taking it a step further. He was saying, you can come into the coalition. And in the coalition agreement that was signed a few hours ago, Mansour Abbas's Islamic fundamentalist Ram party is one of the coalition partners. So you guys, like, we haven't even realized that a huge threshold has been crossed, right? And that is a threshold that, even if it seems scary now, is vital for Israel's survival, in my opinion.
I just saw something just before we started that David Halperin put out. He said, the Islamic Shura Council has agreed to support a government in which Naftali Bennett will be prime minister. That is a true sentence that I just wrote. it's like, it would have been inconceivable, right? Even just a few days ago. So, we did a conversation with Suleiman Khatib from Combatants for Peace, which I know is one of your grantees, last week, and it was incredibly moving. We've brought him to IKAR a couple of times, and I think some of the other Jewish Emergent Network communities have brought him to your place as well. And he also, like you, has a new book that just came out. And one of the things that he talks about is in his transformative journey from being, from being a person who actually stabbed an Israeli soldier in order to get the person's gun, and then served many, many years in prison, was convicted as a 14-year-old child and served more than 10 years in prison. But he goes through this transformation process, and he talks about going to his Palestinian community where his parents and grandparents and great-grandparents have lived, which is being uprooted by the settlement enterprise all around him, but that they would find these artifacts in the ground periodically, where people would go digging and they'd find these ancient Jewish artifacts, and nobody wanted to talk about it, because what it would mean was, in some way, it would seem like it was validating the claims that the Jews were making to the land. And he talks about in the book about his transformation to a place where he can actually acknowledge that Jews have a very old claim to this land, and that doesn't undermine his own claim to this place. And I know that a lot of people are talking about indigeneity now, and questions about who actually is indigenous to this place. And I have a feeling you have strong feelings about this conversation. So who is indigenous to this land, Daniel, and who has a rightful claim to the place?
Well, I do have strong feelings about this, Rabbi. The people who were there when the Jews got there may or may not have been the original indigenous people. We read about them, right? We read about Joshua's meeting them, and I don't know. No one knows. Here's what I'll say. I believe that the conversation about indigeneity is both really important because it's been supercharged and a total red herring, right? And the reason I think that is because both sides in this conflict have invested a lot of energy and time and resource, and sometimes enormous amounts of creativity, in trying to obviate the connection of the other party to the land. So that Arafat used to say, right, there's no evidence that there was ever a second temple, any kind of a Jewish temple in Israel, which is just like patently, obviously not true. There's actually like tons of evidence. A mufti of Jerusalem a couple of years ago said, there is not a single stone in Jerusalem that has Jewish history, right? So like, this is just like an obvious denial of something that we all know. And you hear on the Israeli and the Jewish side sometimes arguments like, Palestinians came to Israel 200 years ago from Saudi Arabia. They were just Bedouin who came within the last couple of centuries. This is also not true, right? But here's my radical proposition. Let's assume for a second that the Palestinian line, that there's no authentic Jewish connection historically to the land, is true. And let's assume that the Jewish line, that the Palestinians just got here a couple of hundred years ago, is true. So as we say in Hebrew, azma, right? So what? Here's the thing. Both of these peoples have a genuine and real connection to this place and to the land. And nothing that any of us do and that anyone does is going to convince either of them that that's not the case. You know, when I lived in Israel, I did this little photo project where I'd go around and I would take pictures of signs, trilingual signs or bilingual signs, in which people had erased the Arabic, right? They had either blacked it out with black paint, or they had put nationalist bumper stickers or stickers over the Arabic language. And what fascinated me about this was, yeah, you could confuse some motorists, I suppose, and some pedestrians, but that wasn't the point, right? The point was to try to assert your obviating of the other's presence in the land. I mean, there's when I say favorite, I obviously don't mean that I like this. I'm just saying one of my favorite examples is both sides complain about the maps used by the other side. And yet, if you look at like official Palestinian and Arab maps in Arabic of Palestine, you often won't see Israel. But guess what? If you look at some official Israeli maps of Israel, including, by the way, a map that I and my staff saw in a wonderful Reform synagogue in a very blue city that was hosting us years ago for a staff retreat, there on the synagogue wall was a beautiful map, an official map that movement of Judaism had issued, with no green line, no West Bank, right? So
I think that was in my kids' school.
This was not in your city, but so these acts of cartographical obviation are maybe satisfying, but they don't change anything, and they don't change anyone's mind. So I would argue that rather than spend a lot of time trying to disprove the Jewish or the Palestinian connection to the land, we accept those connections and work to figure out how we get out of this mess.
So I really hear that. And there is a question here that asks if, just as in the Jewish community, there seems to be a sort of a growing acceptance or understanding of a Palestinian narrative and connection to the land, do you also similarly see that in the Palestinian community that you are in contact with there? And if that's not the case now, what do you think could happen in order to bring this this kind of understanding out more broadly?
Well, here's one thing I can tell you with no hesitation whatsoever. First of all, right, the 22% of the population of the state of Israel that are Arab citizens, they have no issue with the cartography of the region, right? They understand exactly where Israel is. They understand that it's real. They overwhelmingly want to be citizens of that state, and they just want the state to treat them as equals. And here's another thing that I guess may be hard for some people to hear, but I want to, again, just say, I'm just issuing the facts right now. Having acknowledged that both sides in their officialdom try to obviate the presence of the other, in 1988, the PLO recognized the state of Israel. In 1988, years before Oslo, they did it, frankly, because of the first Intifada. And what I mean by that is they realized in their exile in Tunis, right, that the Palestinian street, the West Bank Palestinians themselves, were rising up against Israeli occupation, and were actually calling for a two-state solution, right? Because and so my point in this is the Palestinian officialdom followed the street. West Bank Palestinians are far more aware than any of us on this call, right? Unless there are Palestinians and Israelis on this call, where the borders are between the West Bank and Israel. So, we being any of us, Jews or Palestinians, we can point to these acts of cartographical imperialism as a reason why, or an excuse for saying that there's no one on the other side to talk to, but it's really BS, right? The fact is everybody there knows where the state of Israel is. And the question is, what is the disposition of the West Bank given the settlement enterprise over the last 5+ or 6 decades, right? And the other two big obstacles. One is, what did Bill Clinton have over his desk? It's the economy, stupid. So what I have over my desk is a little note that says it's the occupation, stupid, right? Remembering that at the end of the day, like on the Jewish and Israeli side, that's the thing that we have to contend with. On the Palestinian and Arab side, they have to contend with the movement to not recognize or welcome or accept the idea of an Israel in the region. And I would argue that we've seen ups and downs in both of those positions, right? I mean, we all remember there was a peace accord with Egypt and with Jordan. They've held, right? And in 1993, there was a peace accord with the Palestinians, which hasn't held in the same way, in which people did recognize, and many still do, one of the Abraham Accords, right? I would argue that they're good, of limited utility. The road to peace doesn't run through Bahrain or the UAE. The last month taught us that. And Israel will never be fully accepted in the region by making peace with small countries with which it's never actually been at war. But still, that normalization is super important. So we see that the Arab world is willing to recognize and accept Israel there. So I think that these are things, the intransigence of the moment is a snapshot of now, but it wasn't always that way. It isn't that way everywhere, and it doesn't need to be that way.
I think that's really helpful. I'll tell you, we took an encounter trip a couple of Israel trips ago, and we were going through a refugee camp in Bethlehem, and we were very compelled. I would say the group was very compelled by many of the speakers, and then a group of kids walked by, and they were all wearing T-shirts that said 1948 on them, and the whole mood changed in the group because all of a sudden it felt like we could, this group of Jewish American progressives could get their heads around it's the occupation, stupid, because there's a solution there, which is a two-state solution. But if it's really, if the occupation began 73 years ago instead of 54 years ago, so then we're having a whole different conversation. And a number of people here have asked about one state versus two state solution because they're curious to hear your perspective. I know that there's some talk now about confederation as well that's really gaining steam. And I wonder if you can just weigh in. I mean, is this a liberal American Jewish fantasy, the two-state solution, or is it still actually a possibility so that there could be, in fact, a Jewish and democratic state and a Palestinian state living side by side? Is such a thing even possible in this time, given what it looks like on the ground?
Right. We hear a lot about people who've declared that it's over and people who have declared that it's the only way. And I don't have the wisdom or chutzpah or whatever it is or foresight to know whether that's the case or not. Well, what I'll say is this. The obstacles to a two-state solution have always been and remain not a lack of political creativity, but a lack of political will, right? Like, I can't say it any more clearly. What seems impossible to us is impossible because the people in charge don't want it to happen, right? Again, I'll point back to that golden era of the 1990s, which is a long time ago already. But, it's very clear that even though they didn't say it, the goal of Oslo was ultimately to arrive at a two-state solution. They eventually did say it, by the way. And how did that get stopped? It got stopped by, people talk about the failure of Oslo. But, as I write in the book, Oslo didn't fail. It was never given the chance to fail. It was murdered. It was murdered by a Jewish assassin, a terrorist who murdered the prime minister, and nails in the coffin were placed there by Hamas and Islamic Jihad and Fatah terrorists who carried out suicide bombings and terrified Israelis away from the idea of making peace. So, almost working in concert, the radical extremists were able to destroy that round of the peace process. So yes, it's more difficult and less likely that there will be a two-state solution as the settlements increase, as hearts harden, as intransigence grows. But again, it doesn't have to be that way. And I don't think we should expect political miracles in this realm for sure, and certainly not from the news of today. There won't be, I don't think, any kind of major movement with settlements, peace processes in either direction, by the way. This is a government that, if it forms, will be straitjacketed to do only a few things, because remember, anyone can leave that coalition and the thing fails. So if they try to expand the settlement enterprise, Labor and Meretz and the United Arab List leave, and the government collapses. If they try to bring civil marriage in or loosen the control of the ultra-Orthodox, then Yamina leaves and the whole thing collapses. So they got each other in an interesting position, and so I don't think we'll see a lot of movement there. That said, that doesn't mean that the conditions for a two-state solution, because they don't exist right now, can't exist. And if you talk to our friends at J Street, they'll say that their job now is to keep that idea alive, keep working on the important players with whom they can have some influence, to make sure that if and when the day comes when there's leadership in Israel, leadership in the Palestinian Authority, leadership in the United States and elsewhere that aligns around that idea, there's something to salvage, right? And there I'll just point out that Yair Lapid is a guy who is a two-state solution guy. He's going to be the foreign minister, and if this thing holds up, he'll be the prime minister in 2 years. And friends of mine, some of you know them, are going to be ministers in this government. And I can tell you that Merav Michaeli, the leader of the Labor Party, who will be the Minister of Transportation, unless you think that's a minor appointment, when the Transportation Ministry is responsible for the roads and tunnels and connections between the West Bank and Israel proper and within the settlement enterprise, it's a pretty big deal to have Merav Michaeli as the Transportation Minister, and for other reasons as well. Nitzan Horowitz, the leader of Meretz, is going to be the Health Minister, it looks like. So these are two-state solution people who are suddenly going to be in positions of real authority and power with one of their own, albeit a centrist, ready to take the helm. So I guess I would say it's premature to say that it's dead. And at the end of the day, my personal opinion as Daniel, I think it's still probably the most pragmatic and least impossible of the ways out, but I don't have that as my moral north, right? We're not J Street or Americans for Peace Now or AIPAC, we're the New Israel Fund. And so for me, my moral north is that every Israeli should live with peace, security, dignity, and equality. And all the people who are under Israel's control should have the same opportunity as well. And whatever the political arrangement of that is, right? Again, I believe the two-state solution is still the best, but as long as there is a moral situation that allows for Jews and Palestinians to live their lives with dignity, with a level of self-determination, with safety for themselves, their practice, their culture, then it's for Israelis and Palestinians to say.
Okay. I see the time. It's 6:30. If it's okay, I want to extend for just a couple minutes because there's so many great questions here, and I think people are eager to just hear a little bit more from you. So if maybe we can extend just 5 minutes, and then we'll turn it to Rabbi Rachel Nussbaum to close. I hope that's okay with everyone. So let me ask you two last questions. One of the questions here, you've described Hamas as a cynical organization. And I know that people have described Bibi as the ultimate political operator. And I'm actually quite concerned about what the next week or 12 days will hold, given those forces at play that might be extremely invested in seeing this new government fall apart before it even starts. Do you agree with the analysis that in some way the extreme forces on both sides are really fueling each other for their own political ends, and that might ultimately be what gets in the way of what the majority of the people want, which is actually just to be able to get home safely at the end of the night?
Well, given that I just said a moment ago that I believe it was those extreme forces working in what may as well have been collusion, right? Although I don't think that they were planning together. They were aware of what the others were doing that murdered the peace process and destroyed for a generation the hope of resolution. I absolutely think that's the case. And, it happens on different levels and on different scales. We will see what Prime Minister Netanyahu does on his way out this week to try to disrupt what's happened. I mean, he's already, his rhetoric has become in the last 24 hours positively Trumpian. The biggest fraud ever perpetrated on voters, he's called this coalition, because they succeeded, it seems, where he failed. So we'll see what he does to try to trash this. And clearly, right, Hamas is, they are cynical. I just argued that they were rational, right? And it's in Hamas's best interest. Look, again, here's the third time I'm going to say something that may strike people as provocative. But again, it's history. Hamas emerged, right, in no small part because it was buoyed by Israel, which understood exactly who it was and what it was, didn't know how successful it would be, and saw it as an important counterbalance to the PLO, right, back in the 80s, right? So that, like, this is the law of unintended consequences. So one could argue that, to grossly simplify things, extremists on both sides see this as a zero-sum game. That's a game that they can win. And so they want to win it. They believe that they have the patience, the time, terrifyingly to me, the divine, right, imprimatur to go ahead and try to win the fight. Everybody else, is either, like you said, trying to get home, or people who say, no, like, it's not about winning one side or the other. It's about trying to muddle out some totally imperfect compromise that allows us to get on with our lives.
Thank you for that. Okay, I'm going to ask you, there's a hard piece and a soft piece that you'll answer all at once. And then I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Rachel. So can you tell us what you wish the U.S. government would do in this moment? That's the slightly more difficult piece. I mean, we've heard now about really from the margins to the mainstream about conditioning aid to Israel, and and it seems like there's a whole new language in the discourse now, in the popular discourse, in a different way than we've heard it before. What do you hope the U.S. government will do, and what do you think and hope that we as American Jews can do in this time to support and amplify the really critical work that's happening on the ground? That's the easy question, obviously.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's a fair one. We'll end on that one. Look, the first one is a really hard question. It's not hard because I don't know what I want to say. It's hard because I think it's a hard thing to say. But I believe that the players outside who have influence, and we have by far the most influence on Israel, and I am a Jew who loves that place desperately, and this is my community, so I can speak much more authentically about what I think in terms of the United States and Israel. But I think that this extends to the Palestinians as well, right? But we're not the biggest influencer with Palestinians. We we did have great influence, and we probably will again, but that was tremendously degraded over the last 4 years when Trump and company shut down the East Jerusalem consulate, which has essentially acted as a de facto embassy to the Palestinians, cut off all aid to the Palestinians, to the PLO, closed the PLO offices in Washington. The Biden administration is undoing all of that, but it will take time, and our credibility has been damaged. So having said that, what I would love to see an American president do is issue tough love and tochecha, right? What I mean by that is, I think that the Israeli people, especially over the last 12 or 15 years, and again, Netanyahu has been in power now for 12 years in a row, having suffered the trauma of Oslo and the assassination, and then the trauma of the Second Intifada and the suicide bombings, and then 12 years of a steady diet of us and them-ism, even during a period when terrorism has been at an all-time low, right? And where cooperation with the Palestinian Authority police force, as well as the wall that Israel built, has kept terrorism down to an extremely low level, like we haven't seen in ages, right? Israelis have been fed a steady diet of us and them, and there's no partner for peace. And the Netanyahu years, Netanyahu served to build a conceptual dome over Israelis, essentially shielding them from paying attention to what was happening in the West Bank and the settlements and the occupation, and shielding them from any repercussions, right? When the European Union would timidly suggest that they were going to begin implementing what they call meaningful differentiation, which is an EU law that requires the EU to label products that go into EU supermarkets that come from the settlements as from the settlements and not from Israel. Mind you, it doesn't ban those products. It doesn't boycott Israel. It just says, Israel, you can't put settlement-made products, yogurt, on a shelf, in Brussels that says made in Israel. It has to say made in Israeli settlements. That's right. That's meaningful differentiation, as opposed to made in Israel, because your oaths are made in a kibbutz in the north of Israel. Michael Oren, right, former ambassador to the U.S., an American from Philadelphia, and now an Israeli, MK at the time, said this is Nazi-like anti-Semitism, a boycott of Israel. So that's been the language and the rhetoric that has been poured onto Israelis. That's what they've heard from their leaders for well over a decade. They've been inured from the consequences of the occupation. Unless you're a soldier who's actually patrolling the streets, you don't have to think about it. Settlers don't have to think about it. They crisscross from Israel in tunnels and roads without even realizing that they've crossed the green line. And in that sense, there has been a very successful project of obviating, of disassembling the green line in the mental maps of Israeli Jews, right? And if I were the American president, I would say to the people of Israel, look, what would he say? Hey, man, that's what Joe Biden would say, right? You guys we haven't been honest with you. Your leaders haven't been honest with you. And we here in the West haven't been honest with you. And I love you. I can't do a Joe Biden. I would try if I could. But essentially, you Israelis, you have a choice to make. We want you to be part of the West, the democratic world, as you are now, right? The EU is Israel's biggest trading partner, by the way. Like, not the United States, not Turkey, the EU, right? We want you to remain most favored trade nation status in the EU. We want you to have defense pacts with the United States that assure you that if anyone gets a stupid idea to do anything to you, we're there. We've got your back. We want you to be able to fly to go see Barcelona play on the weekend, or go shopping in Paris, or go see your kids in New York without visas or anything. But friends, you can see that we can't hold off the change that's happening. It's happening in the Democratic Party. It's happening in Europe. And I'm not talking about anti-Semitism, right? I'm talking about a shift that is happening about people in the West perceiving what's going on there. And so you Israelis, you guys have a choice to make. And your leadership has kept the choice from you. And American presidents have kept the choice from you. But here's the choice. You can be part of the West with all the privileges and benefits and protection that provides, or you can choose the settlement enterprise. And then, even though people like me are not going to let on my watch things change, the next Democratic president, the next chancellor in Berlin, the next prime minister in the UK, they're not going to be able to hold this back either. And if you don't believe me, just look at the difference between now and 60 days ago in the way Israel is perceived in the West. And that's your choice, Israelis. And that is what I would do if I were the American president. Finally, what can we all do? Look, there are tens of thousands of Israelis who are involved in something that is very much like a civil rights movement in their country. And I don't mean this as a pitch for New Israel Fund's organizations, but that too. Whatever it is, whatever organization that you fall in love with, whether it's Encounter, whether it's New Israel Fund or Trua, any of the organizations that are working to support those Israelis on the ground who are trying to forge a different kind of future for their country, let them know that you have their backs, right? Engage, learn about them, make donations, go visit them. That's what we all can do. We can accept the nuance. We can say, I love this place and I'm attached to it, and this is a dream worth fighting for, but it doesn't mean that I have to defend all of its bad policies and practices any more than I would in my own country, right? My way of loving America during the Trump years was making a donation to the ACLU and getting out and marching. And there's an analog to that when it comes to Israel. And even though most of us are not citizens, our brothers and sisters in Israel are citizens, and they need your support, and they need to know that we have their back.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I'm going to turn it to Rachel. I just want to say the book's phenomenal. I'm just so grateful to NIF that they gave you a sabbatical so that you could actually write this book and get it out into the world. This is incredible. And I think this will be a game changer. And it's not available yet, but people are asking if they can pre-order the book. So if that is possible, can you let us know how that can happen? Yeah. And I just really, and we'll bring you back again so that we can learn more from you. But Daniel, thank you. This was really incredible. Rabbi Nussbaum, can you close for us?
Great. So Daniel, incredible gratitude to you for sharing those thoughts with us tonight and being so candid and honest. I think that was exactly the kind of space that we were envisioning, that we were hoping that we could create here. It's hard to do it with hundreds of people on a webinar, but here we are. Really grateful to be in that conversation, to be in your brain a little bit, and to be experiencing all of this change together in real time as the world is unfolding. Because things are changing so rapidly, I guess I will just state my hope that we can do this again in the future at some point. Maybe it's when the book is out. Maybe it's when that new government is feeling, this much less shaky, I don't know, and continue these conversations, because I think all of the Jewish Emergent Network communities are very much together in trying to create those nuanced spaces where we can hold multiple truths side by side, and make space for all of those and envision a world of possibility and think about how we might build it there, and also how we might build those conversations here. This is something very rare in the Jewish community, and it's kind of funny that it's so hard to create these spaces, and yet here we are doing it. So with that, I want to thank partners who have come together to make this happen. Our partners at Lab Shul. I know that Amichai is not here because he's in Israel right now. Our partners at the Kitchen and Rabbi Noa Kushner. Our partners at IKAR. Thank you, Sharon, for facilitating that conversation. Our partners at Mishkan. Thank you, Lizzie, for kicking us off today. And those of us who are here in Seattle basking in heat like none of the rest of you have for whatever reason right now. Before the pandemic, there had been a plan, and it had been a plan that involved Kavanah and the Kitchen and Mishkan to create an Israel trip together with members of each of our communities to go and to spend some time on the ground in Israel, in the West Bank, talking to people, getting proximate, like really understanding the situation on the ground. In the green room just before, as we were talking about it, it seems that there's interest in reviving that plan. So if you're listening to this call and you feel inspired that as pandemic world begins to change and travel opens up again, that feels like something that you would want to do, want your community to be involved in, by all means, reach out through your own home communities and let's figure out how to make this happen. And Daniel said maybe he would come with us. So we will figure out how to make that happen. So to future conversations, to continued partnerships, to continued honesty and nuance, and to finding support mutually through one another to get us through these hard times. Thank you all for being here tonight.